the religious flag has certainly affected one industry, that's tourism. You had one guy who shot 36 tourists in Tunisia, basically stopped tourism in Tunisia. Egypt is losing $250 million a month because of that one Russian jet that was bombed on takeoff. And I'm afraid to say that by just having a war against ISIL in Syria, it's not going to help at all. In fact, Syria has become a total nightmare because the people of Syria are living a wretched life. And what Americans should be doing is considering alternatives that would actually improve life in Syria. And it's not happening. And the only thing that's really happening is that they're getting very angry with Russians because the Russians have backed the Syrian government and at the moment are trying to hand Aleppo back to the Syrian government. So they've spent $6 trillion on this flag, Americans, since the first Gulf War, and I would say the world is a more dangerous place for Americans than it was in 1990. So you've got to come up with a credible strategy once you have identified the flag. The second flag is the red flag, which is talked about by some of our German clients. They're very worried about Mr. Putin now. In fact, one German said to us the other day that he feels the Russians are in the same space as Germans were in the late 20s. Very angry. In the late 20s, Germans were very angry with the Treaty of Versailles. They then had hyperinflation, which ruined the German economy, which allowed a small guy called Adolf Hitler to ascend to the throne. And they're very worried that the same is happening in Russia at the moment. And a lot of German companies have physical assets in Russia. And indeed, Germany is Russia's largest trading partner. And of course, there's every chance of an incident in Syria because you've got lots of jets flying around. And yes, one company said, could you please play military conflict scenarios between NATO and Russia? And we can't do that. I mean, we simply haven't got the acumen or the knowledge to do that. But it's just was an interesting flag in itself. The third flag is the one that's changing the global economy the most. It's the grey flag, and it's the aging of the world's population. One statistic I quote in the book is that in 1900, the average lifespan of an American was 47 years. At the end of the century, 2000, it was 83 for men, 86 for women. So we more or less doubled our lifespan as a species because of medical advances. And this has had extraordinary consequences for the global economy. Europe and Japan are the most aging nations on Earth, particularly Japan. In fact, their population is forecast to decrease by around 30 million people, from 125 to 95 million people by the middle of this century. And it just means that the Japanese economy is going to stay flat because old people don't eat as much. They don't do anything as much. And so they can have negative interest rates in Japan, but it's not going to create 7% economic growth. I mean, can you imagine that? You actually pay to have your money on deposit at the bank. It's quite something. Europe is going the same way. They feel that low interest rates will revive the European economy. It's not going to do that. They're an aging population. Greece, in fact, is the oldest population in Europe. It has the highest number of pensioners. So handing 84 billion euro to Greeks to become young is not going to happen. But the place the flags hit the most is China. China has the most rapidly aging society in the world. Not the oldest, just the most rapidly aging because of the one-child policy that they instituted in 1978 that they've now converted into a two-child policy. But that will only affect the economy in 20 years' time. So essentially, we've been saying for years because of this flag that China is going to slow down. It's going to slow down like Europe and Japan. And I'm amazed that more financial commentators don't actually refer to the aging of the Chinese population because it's had a huge impact on commodity prices. and oil prices this, because there is no country to basically replace China at the moment. Everybody turns to India, but India's going to grow, and maybe in 20 years' time it will be the next China, but it certainly isn't going to be the next China right now. The fourth flag is not like the preceding one. The preceding one's clockwork. It's ticking away. You don't have to play scenarios. It's a trend. The fourth one is back to clouds, and it's called the anti-establishment flag. It's the fury that the middle class now have for the super rich. I mean, the poor have always been angry, but now the middle class is angry. And if you look back in history, it's the middle class that creates revolutions. I mean, Robespierre was a lawyer. He started, one of the people who started the French Revolution. Marx also came from a legal family, and he certainly was responsible for a lot of the communist revolution, along with Friedrich Engels, who came from a very rich German family. So why are the middle class getting angry? Well, Thomas Piketty wrote a beautiful book on the subject 2 years ago called Capital in the 21st Century, where he showed that the gap between the super rich and the middle class increases when the return on capital is much higher than the salary and wage growth, which is what the middle class depends on. And for the last 30 years, the return, particularly on property in premium locations, has been much higher than salary increases. And so there's a huge gap now between the super rich and the middle class, who are still struggling. Number one, temperatures. We probably have more access to temperature data than any other organization on Earth, and the vast bulk of that data suggests the world has warmed up by 1 degree centigrade in the last 50 years. And yes, there are places where it's level, and yes, there are places where it's declined, but on the bulk of evidence, it has warmed up. And she said the first country that's really going to be a victim of this flag is Australia. Well, last August, I went to Australia, to South Australia, to do a 2-day workshop with business and government, because the Murray River system, which runs through central Australia, is evaporating at a much greater rate because of the additional heat. I mean, they've even introduced deep purple on the map in central Australia, because a lot of places now are experiencing regularly temperatures in excess of 50 degrees centigrade. I mean, here you think 40 is high. Imagine 50. And so, you know, South Australia is going to have to move to much smarter water management techniques. And there is a scenario now that the whole of Central Australia empties to the coast, because essentially Central Australia becomes uninhabitable because of this flag. The second one is rising sea levels. She says caused mainly by the melting of ice packs in northern Greenland and in the Antarctic. In fact, it could rise by up to 0.5 meter by 2050. That was her figure, 0.5 meter. It's a lot. It's a lot. Don't buy a house on the rocks in Camps Bay. 0.5 meter is a lot. And she said that the places most at risk are the little island groups in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And indeed, I do quite a lot of work in Mauritius, and I've been saying for some time now that they must start measuring sea levels around their coast, because it is now a flag. But it was the third flag, she said, that's going to change everybody's mind about climate change. It's the increasing frequency of extreme weather events. And boy, I've been watching that ever since. And boy, America and Britain and other places have had extreme weather events, rainfall, drought. I mean, we are experiencing extreme drought right now. And of course, people will say it's not due to climate change, or that climate change is cyclical, it has nothing to do with man-made emissions. I know all about the arguments against climate change. But it is a flag, and you've got to watch it, because it is now seriously impacting on industries, and it's seriously impacting on people's lifestyles. The last one I'd like to talk about, which is, all these flags are in the book, we call porous borders. I facilitated a session for Interpol back in 2009. I think it was June 2009. I did a session, and I had most of the heads of police around the world at this session, and it was to look at the biggest risks posed by the criminal world. And number one on their list was porous borders. the idea that any criminal could get into any country, anywhere in the world. And one person then said, it's not just criminals. You're going to see levels of migration that date back to the Middle Ages. People are just going to walk in and away from wars and a bad life and everything else. It's going to start happening, and Europe isn't prepared, particularly. And that is the case. I mean, last year, that flag went up big time. 1 million migrants have made it into Europe. And it just shows that you've got to spot a flag early, because then you can have a proper conversation around it. Whereas at the moment, Europe is in total chaos over this migrancy flag.